The blood-red sun sank below the distant hills, casting long shadows across the small town of Willow Creek, Arizona, as Flora Harris stood on the dusty main street, clutching nothing but a small carpetbag and the tattered remains of broken promises. The year was 1885, and at 22 years old, she had already learned the bitter lesson that love could leave you with less than you started with. Flora brushed a strand of chestnut hair from her face, her green eyes scanning the unfamiliar town that would now be her home or at least a temporary shelter, until she figured out what to do next. The stagecoach that had brought her pulled away with a cloud of dust, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the weight of betrayal still fresh in her heart. 8 months ago, Thomas Wheeler had swept into her life back in St. Louis with his charming smile and grand promises. He'd convinced her to sell her late parents' home and give him the money to invest in a sure-thing gold mine venture out west. They would be married, he said, once he returned with their fortune. Flora had believed every word, handing over not just her inheritance but her heart as well. The letter had come 3 weeks ago. The mine was a sham. Thomas had disappeared with her money and the heart of another woman. All that remained was a scribbled apology and directions to a boarding house in Willow Creek, where he'd supposedly paid for a month's lodging for her, his final act of kindness. The setting sun disappeared completely as Flora made her way down the main street, the sounds of a piano drifting from the saloon. Men in dusty clothes and worn hats passed by, some tipping their hats politely, others eyeing her with curious glances. A woman alone in the West was an oddity, and Flora knew she would need to find work quickly if she hoped to survive beyond the month Thomas had paid for. The boarding house appeared before her, a modest 2-story structure with a small sign swinging in the evening breeze. Inside, Mrs. Blackwell, a stern-faced widow with kind eyes, showed her to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Dinner's at 6 sharp," the older woman explained. "Breakfast at 7. You miss it, you go hungry till the next meal. House rules." Flora nodded gratefully. "Mrs. Blackwell, I need to find work. Would you know of any opportunities in town for a woman who can read, write, and keep accounts?" The older woman studied her for a moment. "The general store might need help. Mr. Finch isn't getting any younger. Or perhaps the schoolhouse, they're always short on teachers out here." She paused. "Though most young women who come here end up working at the saloon or getting married, that's just how it is in these parts." "I'll try the general store first," Flora said quickly. The thought of working in a saloon made her stomach twist and marriage. Well, that dream had died with Thomas's betrayal. The next morning, Flora rose early, donned her best and only presentable dress, and set out to find employment. The general store was her first stop, but Mr. Finch politely declined her offer of assistance. The schoolhouse had already hired a teacher for the year. The hotel had no need for additional staff. By midday, Flora's spirits had sunk nearly as low as her prospects. She found herself standing outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, staring at the swinging doors with dread and desperate calculation. Before she could gather the courage to enter, a commotion down the street caught her attention. A group of ranch hands had gathered around 2 men locked in a heated argument. One was clearly a local shopkeeper. The other was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the practical attire of a working cowboy, worn denim, leather chaps, and a dusty white hat that had seen better days. "You promised that order would be here 2 weeks ago, Jenkins," the cowboy's deep voice carried across the street. "I've got men waiting on those supplies and cattle that need tending." The shopkeeper stammered his excuses, something about delayed shipments and railroad troubles. The cowboy, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, shook his head in frustration. "I can't run the broken sea on promises and excuses." Flora found herself moving closer, drawn by curiosity and the commanding presence of the cowboy. As she approached, he turned suddenly, and their eyes met. Flora froze. His eyes were the startling blue of a summer sky set in a sun-weathered face that spoke of years spent working outdoors. A strong jaw covered with a few days' worth of stubble gave him a rugged appearance, but there was something in those eyes' intelligence, perhaps, or a quiet intensity that held her gaze. He tipped his hat slightly. "Madam." Flora felt her cheeks warm as she realized she'd been staring. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." The cowboy's expression softened. "No intrusion, just settling a business matter." He extended a hand. "Preston Callahan. I own the Broken Sea Ranch about 10 miles outside of town." "Flora Harris," she replied, briefly taking his offered hand. His grip was firm but gentle, his palm calloused from hard work. "New to Willow Creek?" he asked, his gaze assessing but not unkind. Flora nodded. "Just arrived yesterday. I'm looking for work, actually." The shopkeeper, seeing an opportunity to escape the confrontation, quickly interjected. "Miss Harris was just asking around town earlier. Reads and writes and does figures, she says." Preston Callahan's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Is that so?" He studied her for a moment longer. "As it happens, Miss Harris, I'm in need of someone with exactly those skills. My ranch foreman handled the books until he broke his writing arm last month. Been a mess ever since." Flora's heart quickened with hope. "I'm very good with accounts, Mr. Callahan. My father was a banker and he taught me well. It's not glamorous work," he warned. "And the ranch is no place for fancy city folk. It's hard country out there." Flora straightened her spine. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Callahan, and I'm not as delicate as I might appear." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I don't doubt it, Miss Harris." He gestured toward a small cafe across the street. "Why don't we discuss the particulars over coffee? If you're agreeable, you could start tomorrow." Relief washed over Flora like a cool breeze. This was her chance, not just employment, but a way to escape the looming specter of the saloon. "That would be most agreeable, Mr. Callahan." As they crossed the street together, Flora was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople. A single woman taking coffee with a man she'd just met would raise eyebrows in St. Louis society. But this wasn't St. Louis, and Flora had more pressing concerns than propriety. The cafe was small but clean, with gingham curtains and the comforting aroma of fresh bread. Preston pulled out a chair for Flora before taking his own seat, removing his hat to reveal thick, dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Now, Miss Harris," he began after they'd ordered coffee, "I'm curious what brings a city woman like yourself to a place like Willow Creek." "Not many come here by choice." Flora hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I had a change in circumstances. I needed a fresh start." Preston's eyes met hers, and she had the unsettling feeling he could see right through her careful words to the hurt beneath. "Running from something or someone." "Not running," she corrected, lifting her chin slightly. Moving forward, he nodded slowly. "Fair enough, we've all got pasts we'd rather leave behind." He took a sip of the coffee the waitress had placed before him. "The job pays $20 a month, plus room and board at the ranch. You'd have your own cabin, small but private. Meals with the household staff in the main house." Flora's eyes widened. It was more generous than she'd expected. "That's very fair, Mr. Callahan. The work isn't complicated, but it's essential. Record-keeping, correspondence, supply orders, payroll for the hands." He leaned forward slightly. "I run a tight operation, Miss Harris. I expect honesty and hard work. You'll have both from me," she promised, meeting his gaze steadily. Preston studied her face for a long moment, as if searching for something. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded and extended his hand across the table. "Then we have an agreement. I'll send a wagon for you tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock sharp." Flora shook his hand, feeling for the first time since Thomas's betrayal a small flicker of hope. "I'll be ready." As they finished their coffee, Preston explained more about the ranch, 5,000 acres of good grazing land, a herd of nearly 2,000 cattle, and a reputation for the finest horses in the territory. He'd built it from almost nothing over the past decade, starting with just 100 acres and 50 head of cattle. "It's not just a business," he said, his voice softening slightly. "It's a legacy, something that will outlast me." There was pride in his words, but something else too, perhaps loneliness. Flora wondered if there was a Mrs. Callahan waiting at the ranch, but she didn't ask. It wasn't her place to pry, and besides, it didn't matter. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. When they parted ways outside the cafe, Preston touched the brim of his hat. Until tomorrow, Miss Harris. Flora watched him walk away, his tall figure commanding respect from those he passed on the boardwalk. She didn't know what awaited her at the Broken Sea Ranch, but for the first time in months, she felt a sense of purpose. This was her chance to rebuild not just her finances, but perhaps her belief that life could hold more than disappointment. That evening, as she packed her meager belongings and prepared for her new position, Flora caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The face that looked back at her was thinner than it had been in St. Louis, with shadows under the eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worry, but there was something else there too: determination. No more foolish dreams, she told her reflection firmly. No more trusting handsome men with easy smiles and hollow promises. From now on, Flora Harris relies on no one but herself. The morning dawned clear and bright, the early October air crisp with the promise of autumn. Flora was ready and waiting when the wagon pulled up in front of the boarding house, her carpetbag at her feet. To her surprise, Preston Callahan himself sat in the driver's seat, handling the reins of two magnificent chestnut horses. "Mr. Callahan," she greeted him, unable to hide her surprise. "I didn't expect the ranch owner himself to come for me." He offered a small smile as he climbed down to help with her bag. "Had business in town anyway. Besides, thought you might appreciate a proper introduction to the countryside." The journey to the Broken Sea took nearly 2 hours, during which Flora saw more of the Arizona territory than she had ever imagined. The landscape was both harsh and beautiful: rolling hills covered in scrub brush, distant mountains that seemed to touch the impossibly blue sky, and endless open spaces that made her feel simultaneously free and insignificant. Preston proved to be knowledgeable about the land, pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of local history. He spoke with obvious passion about ranching, the challenges of water management in the arid climate, the careful breeding of cattle to withstand the harsh conditions, and the constant vigilance required to protect the herds from rustlers and predators. "It's not an easy life," he admitted as they crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding countryside, "but I wouldn't trade it for anything. There's something about working this land that gets into your blood." As they approached the ranch, Flora could see why Preston spoke of it with such pride. The main house was an impressive 2-story structure built of sturdy timber and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Nearby stood a large barn, bunkhouses for the ranch hands, corrals filled with horses, and various outbuildings. Everything spoke of careful planning and solid construction. "It's beautiful," Flora said sincerely as they pulled up to the main house. Preston's expression softened as he gazed at his home. "Been building it piece by piece for 10 years now. Started with just a 1-room cabin where your place stands now." As if on cue, he pointed to a small but well-maintained cabin about 100 yards from the main house. "That'll be your home while you're here. It's simple but comfortable enough." The wagon had barely stopped when the front door of the main house swung open, and an older woman with silver-streaked dark hair emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "About time you got back," she called out, her tone gruff but affectionate. "Dinner's nearly ready and half the ranch is waiting on those supplies." Preston chuckled as he helped Flora down from the wagon. "Miss Harris, meet Mrs. Eleanor Winters, the finest cook in the territory and the woman who keeps this place running while I'm off chasing cattle." Mrs. Winters' sharp eyes assessed Flora from head to toe. "So you're the new bookkeeper. Hope you're better at figures than the boss." "Man can track a steer for 50 miles but can't add 2 columns of numbers to save his life." Flora couldn't help but smile at the woman's forthright manner. "I assure you, Mrs. Winters, I'm very capable with arithmetic." "We'll see," the older woman replied, but there was a hint of warmth in her voice. "Come on in. You must be hungry after that long ride." The interior of the main house was surprisingly refined for a bachelor rancher's home. The furniture was solid and well-crafted, the floors covered with colorful woven rugs, and the walls adorned with landscape paintings and a few photographs. A large stone fireplace dominated one end of the main room, with comfortable chairs arranged before it. Mrs. Winters insists on civilization, Preston explained, noting Flora's surprise. Says just because we're miles from anywhere doesn't mean we need to live like savages. And he'd be eating off tin plates and sleeping on a bedroll if I didn't insist. The older woman retorted as she led them to a large dining room where a table was set for lunch. The meal was simple but delicious roast beef, fresh bread, potatoes, and vegetables from the ranch's garden. Preston introduced Flora to the ranch foreman, Miguel Ramirez, whose right arm was indeed in a sling, and two other men who made up part of the household staff: Hank, an elderly stable master, and Daniel, a young man who served as Preston's right hand in managing the ranch operations. Flora noted that there was no mention of a Mrs. Callahan, nor any evidence of a woman's touch beyond what Mrs. Winters provided. It was not her concern, she reminded herself firmly, though she couldn't help but wonder why a successful, reasonably handsome man of, she guessed, about 35 remained unmarried in a territory where eligible women were scarce. After lunch, Miguel showed Flora to the small office adjacent to the main house where she would be working. The space was cluttered with ledgers, correspondence, and invoices in various states of organization. Mr. Callahan tried to keep up after I broke my arm, Miguel explained with a grimace. But numbers are not his strength, been chaos ever since. Flora surveyed the mess with a professional eye. I'll need a few days to sort through everything and establish a proper system, but I can manage it. Miguel's relief was evident. Gracias a Dios. The men haven't been paid properly in weeks, and the supply orders are all confused. For the remainder of the afternoon, Flora immersed herself in the tangled finances of the broken sea. Despite the disorder, she could see that the ranch was profitable, impressively so. Preston Callahan might not have a head for bookkeeping, but he clearly had a gift for ranching and business. By the time the sun began to set, Flora had made considerable progress in organizing the most urgent matters. Her back ached from hours of bending over ledgers, and her eyes were tired from squinting at Miguel's cramped handwriting, but she felt a sense of accomplishment that had been missing from her life for too long. A knock at the office door startled her from her concentration. Preston stood in the doorway, his tall frame nearly filling the space. "Mrs. Winters says dinner is ready," he said. "And she also says if you don't come eat now, she'll drag you out by your ear. Her words, not mine," Flora smiled, stretching her stiff shoulders. "I wouldn't dream of defying Mrs. Winters. She strikes me as a woman who means what she says." "You have no idea," Preston agreed with a chuckle. He gestured to the organized stacks of papers on the desk. "Making progress?" "Yes, actually. Your ranch is in excellent financial condition, Mr. Callahan. You just needed someone to put the paperwork in order." Something like relief flashed across his face. "Good to hear. Been worried about that." As they walked toward the main house together in the fading light, Preston cleared his throat. "Mrs. Winters had your things taken to your cabin while you were working. After dinner, I'll walk you over, make sure everything's to your satisfaction." The evening meal was even more substantial than lunch had been, with Mrs. Winters presiding over the table like a general commanding troops. The conversation flowed easily, centered mostly around ranch business, which pastures needed rotation, which horses were ready for breaking, and the plans for the upcoming cattle drive to the railhead in Tucson. Flora found herself fascinated by this glimpse into a world so different from the city life she had known. These people's concerns were immediate and practical: weather, water, predators, the health of the livestock. There was something refreshingly honest about it all. After dinner, true to his word, Preston escorted Flora to her cabin. The night had grown cool, and the stars overhead were more numerous than she had ever seen, the Milky Way a brilliant swath across the velvet darkness. "It's breathtaking," she murmured, pausing to look up at the night sky. Preston followed her gaze. One of the benefits of being far from city lights: never get tired of that view. The cabin itself was indeed small but thoughtfully furnished, with a narrow bed, a dresser, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs, and a pot-bellied stove for heat. Someone, probably Mrs. Winters, had placed a small vase of wildflowers on the table and laid a colorful quilt on the bed. It's perfect, Flora said, genuinely pleased with the simple accommodations. After the uncertainty of the past weeks, having a place of her own even temporarily felt like an unexpected blessing. Preston nodded, seeming satisfied with her reaction. Privy's out back. Well, pump is shared with the main house just there. He pointed to a spot halfway between the cabin and the larger building. If you need anything, main house is always open. Mrs. Winters sleeps light, and so do I. He hesitated, then added, I know this is all new, Miss Harris. Ranch life takes some getting used to, but you seem like a woman who adapts quickly. Flora met his gaze, surprised by the perceptiveness of his observation. I've had to learn that skill recently, Mr. Callahan. Something like understanding passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of shared resilience. Then Preston tipped his hat and stepped back toward the door. Rest well, Miss Harris. Tomorrow will be a full day. After he left, Flora sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night, the distant lowing of cattle, the occasional whinny of a horse, the whisper of the wind through the scrub brush. It was a far cry from the city noises she had grown up with, but there was something soothing about these natural sounds. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of security. She had work to do, a roof over her head and food in her belly. It wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself, but perhaps it was the life she needed now, a chance to heal and rebuild on her own terms. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Flora immersed herself in her new role. The ranch's finances were more complex than she had initially realized, involving multiple markets for cattle and horses, complicated supply chains, and the constant juggling of expenses for feed, equipment, and wages for the dozen ranch hands who worked the property. By the end of her first month, she had not only organized the chaotic paperwork, but had also implemented several improvements to the bookkeeping system that made it easier to track expenses and income. Preston, initially skeptical of her city methods, had become increasingly appreciative of her efficiency and attention to detail. You've saved me more money in a month than I made last quarter, he admitted one evening as they reviewed the monthly accounts together in the office. The oil lamp between them cast a warm glow over the ledgers, and the crackling fire in the small stove kept the autumn chill at bay. Flora glanced up, pleased by the compliment. It's just a matter of proper organization, Mr. Callahan. And perhaps negotiating better terms with some of your suppliers. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those keen blue eyes that always seemed to see more than she intended to reveal. You know, you can call me Preston. After a month of saving my business, I think we're past formalities. Flora hesitated. Despite their daily interactions, she had maintained a careful professional distance. It wasn't just her experience with Thomas that made her cautious, it was also the awareness that her position here was temporary. One day, Miguel's arm would heal completely and her services would no longer be required. Very well, Preston, she finally agreed, the name feeling strange on her tongue. And you may call me Flora if you wish, he smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his usually serious face. Flora, he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. Suits you, like those wildflowers that manage to bloom even in the harshest parts of the range. The unexpected poetry of his words caught her off guard, and she felt a warmth in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the stove's heat. To cover her confusion, she quickly returned her attention to the ledger before them, now about these grazing fees for the north pasture. The moment passed, but something had shifted subtly between them. Over the following weeks, Flora found herself becoming more integrated into the life of the ranch. Mrs. Winters, initially brusque, had warmed to her considerably, even inviting her to help with the preparation of Sunday dinners. The ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully when they saw her, no longer viewing her as an oddity but as a valued member of the operation, and Preston had begun to seek out her company beyond their necessary business interactions. Sometimes he would bring paperwork to her cabin in the evening, staying to discuss ranch matters long after the immediate business was concluded. Other times, he would invite her to ride out with him to see some aspect of the ranch operations. teaching her about cattle breeding or water management with patient enthusiasm. Flora told herself firmly that her growing awareness of him was nothing more than appreciation for his fairness as an employer and his evident passion for the land he worked. If her heart sometimes beat faster when he appeared unexpectedly, or if she found herself looking forward to their evening discussions, it was merely the natural result of isolation. There were few people to talk to at the Broken Sea, after all. But deep down, in a place she refused to acknowledge, Flora knew she was in danger of making the same mistake twice, trusting her heart to a man who had given her no reason to believe he wanted it. One crisp November afternoon, as Flora was returning to her cabin with a basket of mending misses Winters had asked for help with, she spotted a wagon approaching the ranch from the main road. Visitors were rare at the Broken Sea, especially as winter approached and travel became more difficult. She watched as the wagon drew closer, revealing two occupants, a man driving and a woman beside him, both dressed in the fine clothes of city dwellers. Something about the woman's posture, straight-backed and proper, sparked a memory that Flora couldn't immediately place. Preston emerged from the barn, having also noticed the approaching visitors. He stood with his hands on his hips, watching the wagon's progress with a frown of concentration. When the vehicle finally pulled up to the main house, Flora nearly dropped her basket in shock. The woman who descended from the wagon with practiced grace was Eliza Wheeler, Thomas's sister. And the man helping her down was none other than Thomas himself. Flora froze, blood rushing in her ears. What were they doing here? How had they found her? And more importantly, what could they possibly want? Preston strode forward to greet the visitors, unaware of the connection between them and his bookkeeper. From her position near her cabin, Flora could hear only fragments of the conversation, something about business opportunities and investment potential. She should go inside, she knew. Hide until they left. But a strange paralysis had taken hold of her limbs, rooting her to the spot as the scene played out before her. Then Thomas turned slightly, scanning the ranch property, and his gaze landed directly on her. Recognition flashed across his handsome face, followed quickly by something that might have been guilt or perhaps merely annoyance at finding her here. He said something to Preston, gesturing in her direction. Preston's head turned, his expression shifting from polite interest to confusion as he noted Flora's obvious distress. Before she could retreat, Preston was beckoning her over. With leaden feet, Flora approached the small group, clutching her basket of mending like a shield. "Flora," Preston said when she reached them, "these folks say they know you, Thomas and Eliza Wheeler from St. Louis." Thomas smiled, the same charming smile that had once made her heart flutter and her good sense flee. "Flora, darling, what a surprising pleasure to find you here. When we inquired in town about investment opportunities, no one mentioned you were employed at the Broken Sea." Flora found her voice at last, though it emerged more brittle than she intended. "Mr. Wheeler. Miss Wheeler, this is unexpected." Eliza Wheeler, always the perfect lady, extended a gloved hand. "Miss Harris, you're looking well considering the circumstances of your departure from St. Louis." The subtle barb did not go unnoticed by Preston, whose eyes narrowed slightly as he observed the interaction. "Mr. Callahan," Flora said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "would you excuse us for a moment? I believe Mr. Wheeler and I have a private matter to discuss." Preston hesitated, his gaze moving between Flora and Thomas with obvious concern. "Of course, Mrs. Winters can show Miss Wheeler to the parlor for refreshments." As Mrs. Winters led Eliza inside, Preston leaned closer to Flora. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she lied. "Just an old acquaintance from home." Preston's expression suggested he didn't believe her, but he nodded and withdrew to the barn, though not without a backward glance that held both curiosity and concern. Once they were relatively alone, Flora turned to Thomas, anger replacing her initial shock. "What are you doing here?" Thomas had the grace to look uncomfortable. "It's truly a coincidence, Flora. I had no idea you'd settled here. We came to discuss a potential investment in local ranches with Mr. Callahan. His operation has quite a reputation back east." "Investment?" Flora's laugh was bitter. Like the investment you convinced me to make with my inheritance, the one that left me penniless and stranded. Thomas glanced around, obviously concerned someone might overhear. Flora, please, that was an unfortunate situation. The mine venture collapsed unexpectedly. I lost everything too. Except the money to travel in style with your sister, apparently, Flora observed coldly, and the funds to invest in ranches. He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. My father relented and released part of my trust fund after everything happened. I'm trying to rebuild just like you are. What do you want from me, Thomas? Flora demanded, tired of his excuses. His expression softened into the look of contrition she had once found so compelling. Your forgiveness for one thing, and perhaps a second chance. I've thought about you often, Flora, wondered how you were faring. Flora stared at him in disbelief. A second chance? You stole everything I had. I made a mistake, he insisted, stepping closer. One I deeply regret, but seeing you here, it feels like fate, doesn't it? A chance to make things right between us. Before Flora could respond, a deep voice interrupted from behind her. Everything all right here? Preston had returned, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes hard as he looked at Thomas. Thomas straightened, his charm sliding back into place like a well-worn coat. Perfectly fine, Mr. Callahan, just catching up with an old friend. Preston's gaze shifted to Flora, a silent question in his eyes. In that moment, she saw concern there, genuine concern for her well-being, not the calculated interest Thomas had always shown. Mr. Wheeler was just explaining how our previous acquaintance ended, Flora said, finding strength in Preston's steady presence. He was the one who left me with nothing after promising me the world. The reason I came to Willow Creek with only a carpetbag and broken trust. Thomas blanched. Flora, that's hardly fair. It's entirely fair, she cut him off, and completely accurate. Preston's expression darkened as understanding dawned. His gaze hardened as he turned to Thomas. Mr. Wheeler, I think it's best if you and your sister continue your investment discussions elsewhere. The Broken Sea isn't for sale or investment and never will be while I own it. Thomas's charming facade slipped, revealing a flash of the petulance Flora had glimpsed only near the end of their relationship. Now see here, Callahan, this is a private matter between Miss Harris and myself. You have no right to interfere. Preston stepped forward, his height advantage making Thomas take an involuntary step back. On my land, I have every right, and I don't take kindly to men who rob women of their inheritance and then have the gall to come looking for forgiveness when it suits them. For a tense moment, Flora thought Thomas might argue further, but apparently thinking better of confronting the larger man, he merely straightened his jacket with affected dignity. Very well. We'll take our business elsewhere. Come along, Flora. Flora stared at him in disbelief. Excuse me. You can't possibly intend to stay here working as a glorified clerk, Thomas said with a dismissive gesture toward the ranch. Come back to St. Louis with us. I'll make everything right. Flora felt a strange calm settle over her. 6 months ago, such an offer might have tempted her not because she still loved Thomas, but because she had feared being alone in a strange place with no resources. Now, looking at his handsome, insincere face, she felt nothing but pity. No, Thomas, my place is here now. His expression hardened. Don't be a fool, Flora. What future can you possibly have here? Do you think a rough rancher like Callahan can give you the life you deserve? The society, the comfort? Preston tensed beside her but remained silent, allowing her to fight her own battle. Flora lifted her chin. What I deserve is honesty and respect, 2 things you never gave me, and as for comfort. She glanced around at the ranch, at the land that had begun to feel like home. I've found that comfort isn't always about fine clothes and society balls. Sometimes it's about knowing your worth isn't measured by what you own, but by what you contribute. Thomas's face flushed with anger. You'll regret this, Flora, when winter comes and you're stuck in this wilderness with these rustics. You'll wish you'd listened to reason. Preston finally spoke, his voice deceptively calm. Mr. Wheeler, your wagon is waiting. I suggest you use it before I forget my manners entirely. With a final glare at Flora, Thomas stalked back to the main house, presumably to collect his sister. Once he was out of earshot, Preston turned to Flora, concern evident in his expression. "You all right?" Flora released a shaky breath, surprised to find that she actually was. "Yes, surprisingly so. That was the man who left you with nothing." There was a carefully controlled anger in Preston's voice. Flora nodded. "Thomas Wheeler, we were engaged after a fashion. He convinced me to invest my inheritance in a mining venture. Disappeared with the money, then sent me a letter saying the investment had failed and directing me to Willow Creek." Preston's jaw tightened. "And now he has the nerve to show up here, asking for a second chance." "Apparently his father has forgiven his indiscretions enough to release his trust fund," Flora said bitterly. "Thomas always lands on his feet." They watched in silence as Thomas emerged from the main house with Eliza in tow, both looking disgruntled as they climbed into their wagon. As the vehicle pulled away, Preston surprised Flora by placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you said no to going with him." Flora looked up, meeting his steady gaze. "So am I." That evening, Flora sat alone in her cabin, processing the day's events. Seeing Thomas again had been jarring, but not in the way she might have expected. There had been no rekindling of old feelings, no temptation to believe his empty promises. Instead, she had felt only a sense of closure and gratitude for how far she had come since those dark days. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Preston standing there, holding a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "Thought you might need this after today," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Unless you'd prefer to be alone." Flora hesitated only briefly before stepping aside to let him enter. Actually, company would be welcome. Preston set the glasses on her small table and poured a modest amount of amber liquid into each. "Not much of a drinker myself," he admitted, "but some days call for something stronger than coffee." Flora accepted the offered glass, taking a small sip. The whiskey burned pleasantly as it went down, warming her from the inside. "Thank you, not just for this, but for earlier, with Thomas." Preston settled into the chair across from her, his large frame making the small furniture seem almost comically undersized. "Don't thank me. You handled him just fine on your own. Still, it helped having you there." She took another sip. "He was right about one thing, though." Preston raised an eyebrow in question. "Winter is coming," Flora said with a small smile. "And I have no idea what I'm in for," he chuckled, the sound rich and genuine. "Arizona winters aren't like those back east. We get some snow up here in the higher elevations, and it gets cold enough at night, but nothing like a St. Louis winter." "That's a relief," Flora said. Then, gathering her courage, she asked the question that had been on her mind since Thomas's visit. "Preston, was he right about something else too? Am I foolish to think I have a future here?" Preston's expression grew serious. "That depends on what kind of future you're looking for, I suppose." "I don't know anymore," Flora admitted. "For so long, I thought I knew exactly what my life would be: marriage, children, a comfortable home in a respectable neighborhood. Now," she gestured vaguely, "now I'm not sure what's possible." Preston was quiet for a moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "When I first came out here, I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a dream of building something that was mine. Everyone told me I was crazy, that the land was too harsh, the work too hard, the odds too long. Maybe they were right." He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "But I found that limitations are often just challenges in disguise. The future I've built isn't the one I imagined as a young man, but it's real, it's mine, and there's pride in that." His words resonated with something deep inside Flora, a growing realization that perhaps the life she had planned wasn't the only one worth living, that there were different kinds of fulfillment, different measures of success. "I'm beginning to understand that," she said softly. Preston set his glass down, his expression turning earnest. "Flora, I know Miguel's arm is healing well. In another month or 2, he'll be able to take back most of his duties." Flora's heart sank at the reminder that her time at the Broken Sea was limited. "Yes, I'm aware." "But I don't want you to leave," Preston continued, the words coming out in a rush that was uncharacteristic of his usual measured speech. "The ranch runs better with you here. The books are in order for the first time in years. The supplies arrive when they're supposed to, even Mrs. Winters says the place feels more civilized with you around. Flora wasn't sure how to respond. Was this merely a business proposition, an extension of her employment? Or was there something more beneath his words? Are you offering me a permanent position? She asked carefully. Preston ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. I'm offering whatever would make you stay. The implications of that statement hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to address them directly. Finally, Flora said, I'd like to stay, Preston. I've found something here I didn't expect. Relief washed over his features. Good, that's good. They finished their drinks in a companionable silence that was broken only when Preston rose to leave. At the door, he paused, turning back to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. What Wheeler said today about me not being able to give you the life you deserve, he might be right about that. I can't offer society balls or fine parlors. But I can promise you this, Flora. With me, you'll never go without again. Not food, not shelter, not respect. Before she could formulate a response to this declaration, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Flora with a tumult of emotions she wasn't yet ready to name. The weeks that followed brought changes to the Broken Sea. As winter settled over the ranch, the pace of work slowed somewhat. The cattle required less active management, though the horses still needed daily care. Most of the ranch hands used the quieter season to make repairs to equipment, mend fences, and prepare for the spring calving season. For Flora, the work remained steady. Year-end accounting kept her busy, as did planning for the next year's expenses and investments. She had gradually taken on additional responsibilities beyond mere bookkeeping, writing correspondence for Preston, helping Mrs. Winters manage the household budget, and even assisting with planning improvements to the ranch infrastructure. Her relationship with Preston had evolved as well, though in ways neither of them had explicitly acknowledged. They spent most evenings together now, sometimes working side by side in the office, other times simply talking by the fire in the main house after dinner. He had begun teaching her to ride properly, not side-saddle as she had learned in finishing school, but astride, like the ranch women did. On one particularly clear December afternoon, Preston suggested they ride out to check on a herd grazing in the western pasture. The air was crisp but not uncomfortably cold, and the sky was a brilliant blue that seemed to stretch forever. You're getting good at this, Preston observed as Flora guided her mount, a gentle mare named Daisy, over a small rise. Mrs. Winters says you're a natural. Flora laughed, feeling more at ease on horseback than she would have believed possible 3 months ago. Mrs. Winters is being kind. I still feel like I'm going to fall off half the time. Nah, you've got good balance, and Daisy likes you. That counts for a lot. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. The landscape had a stark beauty in winter. The grasses turned golden, the distant mountains dusted with snow, the bare branches of occasional trees etched against the sky like intricate pen drawings. I never thought I could love a place like this, Flora admitted as they paused atop a ridge overlooking a valley where cattle grazed in the distance. It's so different from everything I knew. Preston gazed out over his land, pride evident in his expression. It gets under your skin after a while, the openness of it, the honesty. Yes, Flora agreed. There's nowhere to hide out here. You have to face things directly. He turned to look at her, something unspoken in his eyes. Speaking of facing things directly, there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about. Flora's heart quickened. Oh, Preston dismounted, then moved to help her down from Daisy. His hands were strong and sure at her waist, lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary before he released her. I've been thinking about the future, he began, leading her to a flat boulder where they could sit and look out over the valley. About the ranch, about what I want to build here. Flora nodded, uncertain where this was heading but feeling a flutter of anticipation nonetheless. When I started the Broken Sea, I thought all that mattered was making it successful, having the biggest herd, the finest horses, the most land. He paused, searching for words. But lately I've been realizing that success means something different than I thought. What does it mean to you now? Flora asked softly. Preston's gaze was direct, his blue eyes reflecting the endless sky above them. It means having someone to share it with, someone who sees the beauty in this hard country, someone who understands what I'm trying to build here. Flora's breath caught in her throat. Preston. I'm not good with words like this, he continued, a hint of frustration in his voice. What I'm trying to say is, these past months with you here, the ranch has felt more like a home than it ever has. And I've been thinking that maybe a gunshot cracked through the air, startlingly close, cutting off Preston's words. In an instant, he was on his feet, positioning himself between Flora and the direction of the sound. Get behind that boulder, he ordered, his voice transformed from tender uncertainty to commanding surety. As Flora scrambled for cover, Preston drew the revolver he always carried when riding the property. Another shot rang out, and Flora heard the distinctive whine of a bullet passing too close for comfort. From her position behind the boulder, she could see 3 riders approaching rapidly from the direction of the north pasture. Rustlers, Preston muttered, his expression grim. They've been hitting ranches all through the territory this winter. What do we do? Flora asked, fighting to keep her voice steady, Preston's jaw set in a determined line. We can't outrun them there between us and the ranch. Best chance is to hold position here until they either give up or my men hear the shots and come investigating. He fired a warning shot into the air, then called out, That's far enough. This is broken sea land and you're not welcome here. The riders slowed but didn't stop, spreading out in a manner that made Flora's stomach clench with fear. They were being flanked. Preston, she whispered urgently, there's one trying to circle around behind us. Preston nodded grimly. I see him, stay down. The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire and shouted threats. Preston, despite being outnumbered, held his position with steady determination, his aim true enough to keep the rustlers at a distance without yet hitting any of them. Don't want to kill anyone if I don't have to, he explained during a brief lull in the shooting. Most of these men are just desperate, not evil. His compassion, even in the face of danger, struck Flora deeply. This was the measure of the man, not just his courage, but his fundamental decency. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for the welcome sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of the ranch. Reinforcements had arrived, 3 of Preston's ranch hands, rifles at the ready. Seeing themselves suddenly outnumbered, the rustlers retreated hastily, disappearing over the ridge to the north. You all right, boss? Called Miguel, who had led the rescue party despite his still healing arm. Preston nodded, the tension gradually easing from his shoulders. We're fine. Good timing. As the danger passed, reaction set in, and Flora found herself trembling not just from fear, but from the rush of emotions that accompanied survival. Preston noticed immediately, moving to her side and placing a steadying arm around her shoulders. You did good, he said quietly. Kept your head, most city folk would have panicked. Flora managed a shaky smile. I think I did panic, actually, I just did it quietly. His answering laugh held relief and something warmer. Let's get you back to the ranch. The ride home was subdued, the excitement of the earlier attack giving way to weary vigilance. Preston sent 2 of the hands to track the rustlers' direction, not expecting to catch them but wanting to know which way they had gone in case they returned. By the time they reached the ranch, word of the attack had spread, and Mrs. Winters was waiting anxiously on the porch. She fussed over them both, insisting Flora take a hot bath while she prepared a special dinner to settle the nerves. Later that evening, after a meal that no one had much appetite for despite Mrs. Winters' best efforts, Flora found herself alone with Preston on the main house porch. The night was clear and cold, the stars impossibly bright overhead. I'm sorry about today, Preston said after a long silence. You shouldn't have been put in danger like that, Flora shook her head. It wasn't your fault, and besides, I'm beginning to understand that danger is just part of life out here. You face it, you deal with it, and you go on. He studied her face in the dim light spilling from the windows. You're a remarkable woman, Flora Harris. Most would be packing their bags after a day like today. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Something shifted in Preston's expression, a softening, a decision made. "Before we were interrupted earlier, I was trying to say something important." Flora's heart quickened. "Yes," he took a deep breath. "I was trying to ask if you might consider staying here permanently, not just as my bookkeeper, but as my wife." Though she had begun to hope for something like this, the actual words still took her breath away. "Preston," he hurried on, as if afraid she might refuse before he could make his case. "I know it's not what you planned for your life. I know a ranch in the Arizona territory is a far cry from a fine house in St. Louis, but I think we could build something good together, Flora. Something real." Flora looked at this man, this strong, decent, hardworking man who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness since the day they met. Who had given her not just employment but purpose. Who had never once made her feel like anything less than an equal partner in the work they shared. "When Thomas left me with nothing," she said slowly, "I thought I'd lost everything that mattered, my home, my security, my future. I came west because I had nowhere else to go, not because I chose it." Preston's expression remained carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders as he waited for her answer. "But now I understand that losing those things was the beginning, not the end. It brought me here. To this land, to these people." She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "To you," hope kindled in his eyes. "Is that a yes?" Flora smiled, feeling a certainty she had never known with Thomas, a certainty born not of desperate dreams but of shared values and genuine affection. "Yes, Preston Callahan, I will marry you." The relief and joy that transformed his face made him look younger, almost boyish. He pulled her gently into his arms, his embrace warm and solid in the cold night air. "I promise you, Flora," he whispered against her hair, "with me, you'll never go without again. Not just the necessities, but all the things that truly matter: respect, honesty, partnership. A home that's really a home." As his lips met hers in a kiss that held both tenderness and promise, Flora knew that he would keep that vow. Not because he was perfect, he wasn't. Neither of them was. But because he understood, as Thomas never had, that true security came not from wealth or position, but from building something meaningful together. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch with Mrs. Winters weeping openly. "Just got dust in my eye," she insisted, and the ranch hands dressed in their Sunday best. The justice of the peace rode out from Willow Creek to perform the service, and the celebration afterward, with music provided by 2 of the hands who played fiddle and harmonica, lasted well into the night. That evening, as Flora stood beside her new husband on the porch of what was now their home, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, she felt a profound sense of rightness, of having found her place in a world that had once seemed so hostile and uncertain. "Happy?" Preston asked, his arm around her waist, his voice holding a note of wonder as if he still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. Flora leaned into his embrace, savoring the strength and warmth of him. "Happier than I ever thought possible. Even without those society balls and fine parlors Wheeler talked about," she laughed softly. "Especially without those. I've learned that the trappings aren't what make a life worth living. It's the substance beneath." Preston turned her gently to face him, his expression serious in the fading light. "I want you to know something, Flora. What I said that day about you never going without again, I meant every word, but it's more than just providing. I want to build a legacy with you, something that lasts." "We will," she promised, reaching up to touch his face. "Together." As winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, the broken sea thrived under their combined stewardship. Flora's organizational skills and financial acumen complemented Preston's practical knowledge of ranching and his innate understanding of the land. Together, they implemented improvements that increased the ranch's productivity while maintaining Preston's commitment to sustainable practices. More important than the business success, however, was the home they created together. The main house, once merely functional, became a warm and welcoming place filled with books, music, and laughter. They hosted community gatherings that brought together the isolated ranching families of the region, building connections that strengthened everyone. By their first anniversary, Flora was expecting their first child, a prospect that filled them both with joy and trepidation. "What if I'm not good at this?" Preston worried late one night as they lay together, his hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of Flora's belly. "My own father wasn't exactly an example worth following." Flora covered his hand with hers. "You'll be a wonderful father. You already care so deeply, that's the most important thing." He kissed her forehead, his voice rough with emotion. "I just want our children to have what I didn't: stability, security, parents who are there for them no matter what." "They will," Flora assured him. "We both know what it means to go without those things. We won't let that happen to our children." Their daughter, Elizabeth Eleanor Callahan, arrived on a stormy October night with Mrs. Winters serving as midwife and Preston pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door until the old woman finally took pity on him and allowed him in to meet his daughter. The sight of Preston, her strong, capable husband who could face down rustlers without flinching, rendered nearly speechless by the tiny bundle in his arms, brought tears to Flora's eyes. "She's perfect," he whispered, awe and terror mingled in his voice. "So small, so perfect." As Elizabeth grew, so did the broken sea. Preston's innovative breeding programs produced cattle that thrived in the harsh Arizona climate, and his horses became sought after throughout the territory. Flora's management of the finances allowed them to weather the economic downturns that devastated many neighboring ranches. 2 years after Elizabeth's birth, their son James Preston Callahan joined the family, completing their happiness in a way neither had thought possible when they first met. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat together on the porch watching their children play in the yard under Mrs. Winters' watchful eye, Preston took Flora's hand in his. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying here instead of going back east with Wheeler? Taking a chance on a rough rancher with more dreams than sense?" Flora looked out over the land that had become so dear to her, the rolling pastures, the sturdy barns and corrals, the distant mountains that changed color with the passing hours. She thought of the community they had built, the friends they had made, the family they had created. "Not for a single moment," she said with absolute certainty. "Thomas offered me empty promises. You offered me a partnership. He wanted to possess me. You wanted to build with me." Preston's fingers tightened around hers. "Best decision I ever made, asking you to stay." Flora leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her like the golden light of the setting sun. "Mine too." As twilight deepened into night, and the first stars appeared in the vast Arizona sky, Flora reflected on the strange and winding path that had brought her here. Thomas's betrayal, which had once seemed like the end of everything, had actually been the beginning of something far more precious than she could have imagined. She had come west with nothing but a carpetbag and broken dreams. She had found a home, a purpose, and a love that grew stronger with each passing day. Preston had kept his promise. With him, she had never gone without again not just the material necessities, but the essential elements of a life well lived: respect, partnership, belonging, and love. Together, they had built not just a successful ranch, but a legacy of hard work, integrity, and deep connection to the land and each other. As their children's laughter drifted up from the yard, and the familiar sounds of the ranch settling for the night surrounded them, Flora knew with bone-deep certainty that this, not the life she had once planned in St. Louis, was exactly where she was meant to be. And when Preston turned to her, his eyes reflecting the starlight and 5 years of shared joy and challenges, she saw in his face the same certainty, the recognition that sometimes the best futures are the ones we never planned for but discover along the way. "I love you, Flora Callahan," he said simply. "And I love you," she replied, the words carrying the weight of everything they had built together and everything yet to come. "Always."